It started on a site where people are able to discuss and talk about a game called Meriden 59. I was in one of the chats when a person called UFoul joined in on a conversation. It started nice and friendly. He stated that we had played together once, and that he was pleasantly surprised to see me in the chat. Even though I couldn't recall his name, maybe because I played with so many people, I enjoyed the conversation we had, and after a while, I gave him my Discord tag. We parted ways after that, and he said to add me soon so we could play together in the future. The next morning, I saw a friend request in my Discord, and saw that his Discord name was the same one as the one in chat yesterday. I added him, and after waving, he immediately came online. "Hey," his first message read. I responded with a hello back, and we started chatting again. After 15 minutes of polite conversation, I curiously asked him where his name came from. He didn't respond for a minute, but eventually he told me that it was an anagram for something fun. A bit weirded out, I didn't question him further, and told him I was going to go and do something else, not specifying what that was, or informing him any further. He wasn't really happy about it, but reluctantly said, fine. I started to find his behaviour a bit weird, but shrugged my shoulders and started to boot up a new MMO I discovered some time ago. After 3 hours of playing, it happened. I became a bit nervous, and the hair on my neck started to rise. As I was reading the in-game chat, a player called UFoul joined the game. With such an obscure tag, I knew it could only be him again. I tried to calm myself down. It could be that this was just a coincidence, and it was just a meaningless thing. But soon enough he typed, "Hey Ellen," in the chat. And I just knew I was dealing with a stalker. Not responding to him, I blocked him on Discord and Steam, and I also made my socials private, so if he went snooping around he couldn't find me. I'd heard enough creepy stories to know what stalkers are like. A bit relieved I was safe again, I let out a sigh of relief. I was glad it was a minimal encounter, and I dealt with it before it went out of hand. Or so I thought. Not even 5 minutes after blocking him, I got an email from a person called Redacted. It contained only 5 words, but it was enough to make me really, really scared. "You made a big mistake." My blood went cold as I read it. I had no idea how he could have gotten my email. I use a fake mail for most of my accounts. I didn't know how to deal with it, or what to do anymore. None of the stories I had heard prepared me for this, and I felt a creeping fear that this guy was going to do something very bad. I emailed him back, saying that I blocked him for a reason, that he was seriously creeping me out, stating I would go to the police if he continued like this. I then proceeded to create a new main email account and deleting the old one. It was going to take me some time to change my email everywhere, but I wanted to get rid of this guy as quickly as I could. For a few days, nothing new happened. It seemed that he had lost his trail on me, and I prayed that he also wouldn't bother anyone else. After college, I went home and booted up my computer to be welcomed by a new mail, a mail to my new main account. I was nauseous, immediately, and felt sick to my stomach as my hands began to tremble. Redacted had sent me a mail. It read this: "In shadows I dwell, an eternal dance with your fears. No escape, no sanctuary. My obsession, a relentless spectre haunting your every step. I love you so much, my ever love. My dove that only wants me, dying. You'll regret it though. You making me cry. I love you. I follow you." I, now in full panic mode, went to the nearest police station, showing them all the evidence, asking them for help. They stated there wasn't much I could do besides putting down a complaint against an unknown. They told me to change my accounts again and to make sure I remained as safe as I could. When I got home, I started crying. I never asked for this, and I was so scared someone was going to hurt me. Still in tears, I decided to call my dad, who was on a business trip at the time. I wanted to hear his voice, and I wanted him to make me feel safe again. He didn't pick up at first, but after the third call, he eventually picked up, and I started blurting out everything. After not hearing him say anything back or making any noise, I went quiet. The other part of the line was quiet too, only for a faint, heavy breathing on the other side. I started crying again and whispered, "Dad?" But my questions was answered by the other side of the line, ending the call. I stood there for a couple of minutes, staring at the phone, not knowing what to do. I wanted to head back to the police again and have them check whether my dad was safe, but I was unable to move. I was so afraid and shocked, and that made me just stand there like a statue glued to the ground. I only could move again when the power of my house went out. My heart dropped, and frantically I started swiping on my phone to put on the flashlight. Had he found me? Did he cut off the power? Was he going to kill me? Never in my life had I been so scared. I quietly went up the stairs, heading to my room, listening to any sound that could indicate he was entering my house. Reaching my room, I started to think that maybe something else had happened, trying to rationalize the power cutting out. Maybe it was just a malfunction and the whole street was out. How could a crazy stalker have found out a way to cut out my power, let alone finding my house when I never told my location to anyone online? It was as I entered my room, I heard the sound of shattering glass downstairs. I now was fearing for my life, and I even peed myself a little. I quickly opened my closet and removed the grate that was at the bottom of the wall in the back. It used to be the entrance to the crawl space that led to the attic, but because of renovations, it was now a small space cut off from the entirety of the house. I was putting the grate back in when I heard footsteps running around my house. Doors were being opened with force, and things were breaking and thrown everywhere. It went quiet for a second, when all of a sudden, the footsteps rushed upstairs, and the door to my room was thrown open. Through the grate, I saw a small beam of light shining through the door of my closet. The beam became brighter, and the footsteps louder as it came closer to the door. The latter was slammed open, and the light ran through the closet. Only a bit of clothing was hiding the grate leading to me now. My heart was racing, and cold sweat was running down my spine. I slowly placed my hand in front of my mouth to mask my breathing. Tears were running down my face, but I managed to stay completely silent. He went deeper into the closet, shining his flashlight everywhere. I could hear his heavy breathing and smell the stench that came off him. I could only see a little bit of him through the mix of grate and clothing, but I did manage to see something. He was large, very large, wearing stained clothing with some stains looking like blood. In his left hand, he held a flashlight, and in his trembling right hand was a big, dull kitchen knife. He was now standing practically beside the grate. Only the clothes of the clothes hanger were masking the top half of it. I was counting down the seconds before he found me, when he made a blood-curdling scream and ran out of my closet, closing the doors behind him. He started frantically running around my house screaming my name, and "I love you, let me take care of you, my dove." It took 4 hours for him to calm down and give up. I heard him opening my front door and leaving. I started crying heavily from the trauma I'd just lived through. It took some time for me to calm down a little and call the police. Comforting me, the responder told me a unit was on the way to the house and to remain where I was. He stayed on the line till I heard the sirens, and then told me to remain strong before finishing the call. Hearing the sirens coming closer, I started opening the grate and started to climb out of my safe space. I couldn't believe that I was still alive and was thanking God, when suddenly, my closet doors were thrown open and a man rushed at me. He grabbed me by my throat and slammed me against the wall. I could feel my blood being cut off to my head because of the grip, and in the darkness, I could see his big dark eyes looking at me, flashing his yellow rotten teeth in a wicked smile. "I've caught my dove," was what I heard when a knife was thrust into my stomach. My vision got blurry, and I started drifting away, losing consciousness. "I'll always be with you," was the last thing I heard, before I passed out. I saw a big light when I opened my eyes. I thought I was in heaven, but when I opened them fully, I realized it was a hospital. I was hooked up to various life supports, and a bag with an unknown fluid went into my vein. A nurse came into my room and surprisingly said, "You're awake." Soon after, a doctor and a police officer came into the room. The doctor told me I'd been out for 3 days and was recovering from a stab wound to my stomach and the infection that followed it. He then nodded at the officer, and the officer started speaking. He stated that after I lost consciousness, the police arrived at my house and found me laying on the ground, bathing in my own blood. They called the ambulance, and because of a wonder, as he said, I survived. He told me that the person who had entered my home didn't leave any DNA behind, and even my throat was wiped clean by him to make sure nothing was left behind. The only thing they found was a note stating, "The ninth dove for my pen." I'm still in the hospital recovering. I don't know what to do next, but I wanted to write this to make everyone aware of this. Do not trust people you meet online. He might be one of them. Around my area, there's an old urban legend of a condemned tunnel that used to be part of the railroad that ran throughout my town. It was really active until the 80s, when the train derailed in a freak accident and killed everyone on board. The tunnel the train ran through was devastated, only made worse by the crews who cleared the rubble in an attempt to save all of the passengers. Once all of the bodies were recovered and the city confirmed that there were no survivors on board, the city decided to condemn the tunnel rather than spend the money to fix it. The area was closed off, but several teenagers in the area would go there to prove how brave they were to one another, but always left in fear before going in too deep. When I was 16, I too was one of those teenagers who went in. My friend Wayne and I went into the tunnel to impress the girls in our class, and forever regretted it. Finding an entrance to the tunnel wasn't hard, as the chain link fence that was placed around the tunnel had been battered and was barely standing anymore due to the amount of people who had entered before us. As soon as we entered, the first thing we saw were pieces of the wreck that had been left after the accident. While the train had derailed, there were some cars that were still standing. The main thing people would do is explore the cars and see how long it would take for someone to back out in fear and leave. As we went in to explore the tunnel, Wayne and I turned on our flashlights and walked deeper inside. Most of the tunnel had been demolished by the damage done by the train. Rubble from the ceiling had fallen down, and most of the area was only accessible from walking through the cars. From what we had heard, there were 3 cars that had crashed into the tunnel. It seemed as though everyone ran out of the first car, but Wayne and I were determined to make it through all 3. Ready to make our way into the tunnel before us, Wayne and I moved forward and approached the first car. The first car had been tipped over on its side in the accident, but was still able to be entered from the door missing in the back of it. Walking in, we could immediately see why most people ran as soon as they walked in. While all of the bodies had been recovered after the accident, some of the pieces of them weren't. The walls and the floor of the train car were covered in blood and half-rotten organs. One of the seats had been knocked over on the floor, and someone's decayed leg was crushed underneath. The air was filled with the smell of rotting flesh and death. It took everything to not puke from the sight alone, let alone the oppressive stench that dominated the room. As we walked further, Wayne stepped on the severed hand of someone who had died here decades ago, disturbing the maggots and ants that called the mutilated hand home. This was what drove Wayne over the edge, and caused him to vomit on the side of the rows of the seats that ran parallel to us. I couldn't blame him. The sight and smell of the vomit on top of what was in there caused me to vomit as well. As we made it to the end of the cars, I was so glad to continue onwards, thinking whatever may lie ahead of us would be much better than what lied behind us. We then walked into the second car, and I was relieved at first to see this one was completely empty. Then I realised why no one had ever made it past the second car. Immediately, the inside of the car was swallowed by a wave of shadow that smothered all rays of light that dared to enter the interior. Surrounded by darkness with no way to see in front of or behind you was terrifying enough. Completely engulfed in the maw of darkness, the sounds of the day all of these passengers met their end started to play all around us. As if it was being projected into our minds, the spirits of the victims of the accidents, most screaming, others choking to death on their own blood, and the sounds of the impact, All of them, forever stuck in a liminal space between what was and what shouldn't be. Wayne and I somehow find the exit to the car and ran through the first one, over the mangled organs that had been left to rot, and the jagged pieces of glass and metal that had been twisted by the crash. Once finally out of the car, and at the entrance of the tunnel, we both fell to the ground and wept. We never made it to the third car, and from what I've heard, no one ever has. I don't know what may have been in that third car, but if it was even half as bad as what was in the second one, I'd rather die than find out for myself. The horrors we saw there may have lasted only moments for us, but they'll stick with us for the rest of our days. However, the rest of our days is nothing compared to the rest of eternity that the spirits have to endure reliving it. I haven't kept up with Wayne since then. I've sort of drifted away from everyone and kept to myself. The last I heard of him, he kind of did the same, but later I heard he couldn't take it anymore, and went back to see what was in that final train car, and never returned. That was 3 years ago. If ever heading into an abandoned area, I urge you to be careful. Whatever you see in there could lead to the end of your life, or stay with you for the rest of it. At the time of the sleepover, it was me and my best friend, both aged 7 or 8. We are both now 16 and 17, and haven't talked about this incident since. We lived in Florida, about 15 minutes away from Tampa. It was one of our many sleepovers we had, and it was no different from the others. We played with Barbies, watched movies, read books, until we couldn't take it anymore, and went to bed around 9 or 10. I turned off the lights and climbed up to my top bunk, where both me and my friend were going to sleep. As I laid down, something immediately didn't feel right. The house I lived in was relatively old, and our landlord sucked and never came to fix anything, let alone did he only ever care when our rent was due. Before getting in bed, I flipped on my fan and had my mum turn the AC down, but as I got in bed, my fan was turned off, and so was the AC. But I just thought the power went out and didn't think much of it. About 20 minutes go by and I can't sleep, and I feel like I'm dying of heat stroke. I'm not sure if my friend is awake, so I say her name quietly. She responds immediately saying, "I can't sleep, but it's not because it's hot." I look over and can barely see but her silhouette. I look up at the ceiling and sigh and say, "What is it then?" She responds saying, "It's the man in the corner." When I say I got chills, I got chills. I look over at her slowly and turn my head to look at the corner. I thought she was lying because I didn't see anything. I let out a breath of air I didn't know I was holding in. I go to adjust my blanket, and that's when I see him. A man, dark and tall, seeming to stare at both of us. I immediately grip my friend's hand and close my eyes hard. "We have to get my mum," I whispered, and I felt my friend nod, but we both laid there, unable to move. All of a sudden, I felt the movement of someone climbing up the ladder and crawling slowly. The blankets moved with the movement, and I slowly opened my eyes to watch the man slowly starting to crawl towards us. I was gasping for air and looked over to see my friend watching too, paralysed from moving. I look back at the man and can only see his outline, no features. I hold my friend's hand tight and say, "Scream when I tap your finger." I barely got it out in a whisper. She slowly nodded, and as I watched the man slowly reach for my face, I tapped her hand and we both screamed bloody murder. My mum came running in no later than 20 seconds and turned on the light. Both me and my friend were holding each other crying. There was no trace of the man, and my mum checked all doors, all cupboards, all wardrobes, saying that they were all locked and weren't even touched. We both slept on the couch that night, watching Barbie movies and holding each other tightly. To this day, I don't know what it was or who it was, but I will always remember the eerie feeling of death being so close to my face.